Hi.
Hi.
All right. We have come to the point that Krista and I have been talking about for a long time. So we're glad that you can join us and listen in on our conversation with each other. So you all know a lot about me, or most of you do know a lot about me, but I would like them to learn more about you. So will you share with us a little bit about yourself and kind of what are some of the threads that brought you to this point in this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to say up front that I'm obviously going to leave out a lot of details and nuances just for the sake of time. So I'm going to give you some highlights over the last several years. I grew up in the church, in the RCA. My dad was an RCA pastor and then later a leader in the denomination. So that was my experience. And I had a really strong rule follower part, so I didn't really ask too many questions. I just kind of went along with it for most of those growing up years. And it wasn't until I got into college where things started to come up against me in a way that made me pause and question. So I went to Hope College, surrounded again with Christians, kind of a Christian environment. And that's where I met Mike, my husband. And there's just one moment that I want to name that felt kind of pivotal for me at that time. And that was, we had a class called Christian Love. And they invited different speakers to come in occasionally. And I will never forget the class where a person came in and he said that he was a pastor. And he also said that he was gay. And my mind was blown. I was just like, I didn't know those two things could go together. And to be totally honest, we didn't talk a ton about it growing up, but somewhere in me, it had been modeled or shown that sexualities other than heterosexuality were not okay or were sinful in some way. But then I'm meeting this person, right? And I think what you said a couple weeks ago about you came up against an experience and you were just like, wait. And that's exactly what that was. Like, I have to pause. I have to think about this. This doesn't align with what I thought I knew or what I was taught. And my husband, Mike, is a scientist in nature, and so he asks a lot of questions. And so it is one of my favorite parts about him. And so he and I have very much been on this journey together, and I invite you to talk to him as well when you get a chance. But we have dialogued about this over the entirety of our relationship. And yeah, just started asking a lot of questions about why do I believe what I believe? I've never actually really thought about it. So that was a big piece. So I decided to go to seminary. A lot of people had said, I think you would be really good in ministry. And I was pretty sure I didn't want to be a pastor, but I thought maybe pastoral counseling or something like that would be a good fit for me. And Mike also went to seminary. I joke about how he went to seminary only because I was going, but he says there are other reasons. I don't know. You'll have to ask him about that. But it was life-changing. It was so formative for us. We had amazing professors who, I thought I was asking questions. They really helped kind of tear down, essentially, what I thought I knew and helped me ask better questions. And I will be forever grateful for that. And honestly, they might not think this is great news, but they helped me have some clarity around the fact that I didn't want to be a pastor. And so...
Unintended consequences.
Yes, yes. So I decided after getting my MDiv, I still wanted to go on and do social work. So I got my master's in social work after that. And that was, again, one of those moments, being in that program, where I had, so keep in mind, the last 7 years at Hope and at seminary, I was surrounded by Christians primarily. So in my social work program, I was exposed to a lot of different kinds of people. People who were very different from me, people who had no religion, people who had different religions and faiths and sexual orientations and all the things. And it really struck me, like, there are these amazing people in the world who are doing incredible things and who want to change the world and make it a better place, and they don't believe in God, or they believe in something else. And so they're not doing it because they're afraid they're going to go to hell, or because God told them to, or the Bible told them to. They just want to make the world a better place, just because they care about humans. And that was pretty amazing for me to learn. And also, I remember learning about the core values of social work and thinking to myself, these core values, which are like service, social justice, dignity and worth of the human being, importance of human relationships, integrity, when I learned about those, I remember thinking, this feels more in alignment with what I think Jesus was talking about than what Christianity has become in our world. And that all of those things were really important for me in my journey. So at the same time that I was in the social work program, we were attending here, actually. So that was like 2007 to 2012 when Julie Vanderveen Van Til was the pastor. And Mike and I had a ton of conversations with her about all of our questions and doubts, and she was just on board. She encouraged us to ask questions. She helped us think through it. And that was amazing. I have been so honored to have so many people in my life who I have been honest with and who have been able to hold that with me. And she was one of those people. And alongside of that, I want to just have a little caveat to say I met Mara in seminary, but she was a couple years ahead of me. And
I was the Greek tutor, which is also how I met Billy, by the way. His grades got a lot worse after we started dating.
Conflict of interest? I don't know how that works.
This is the most awkward conversation I have ever had, and I've had a lot of awkward conversations, but was telling the professor, who was an old man who didn't have the best filter, telling him that I was dating one of the students, and so I shouldn't grade his quizzes anymore. I won't tell you the nature of the awkwardness, because it was awkward and offensive. Anyway. So we met in seminary.
We met, right, and then after I think we graduated, right, there was a group of 6 of us who started meeting together. It started 2 or 3 times a year, right?
I think so.
And what was our original name?
Affinity Network?
Affinity Network. I think everybody calls us something different. What do your kids call us?
They call us the Pastors Network.
Oh, okay.
But that's not true anymore.
I just call it like our ladies group.
Ladies group.
Because all 5 of them had been pastors at one
Gal
point.
pals.
Gal
That's
pals.
what they call it. Gal pals.
So I'm the only one in the group who was never a pastor, and now I think there are 2 remaining.
2 of us
who
have
are
kept up
pastors,
at it. Yep.
You and Sarah. And then you who know Mara has talked about our good friend Becky, who died almost exactly 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Next week. And so do you want to tell them about her?
Yeah, we're matching. Do you see that? It's our power jacket, also our Becky jacket, because Becky had a really amazing sense of style, and she had a black leather jacket, and we were all like, ooh, need one of those. And she helped us all shop for a black leather jacket. And so now anytime we want to feel extra power within ourselves or an extra connection to Becky, we wear our Becky jackets. So here we are.
Because Becky was a big part of this too, and
Yes.
she had a lot of questions.
Becky was full of questions.
And she would be so happy.
I know, she is here with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
She was a conversation partner for sure along the way,
absolutely.
including questions of life and death, and she died of cancer.
Yeah, so along with Mike, those 5 women have been extraordinary because, again, they have been or currently are pastors, and I came to them with all of my stuff, right? When I was like, I don't know if I believe in God. I don't know if I believe this stuff that we learned or that, that kind of thing. They just held it with me and continue to hold it with me. And I am extremely grateful for that. So there was a point where Mike and I decided we were ready to start maybe thinking about having kids, and we wanted to go on an adventure first. So we went on a road trip, and I just want to give you a couple highlights from that, because part of our road trip was we decided to interview people along the way. Some of those people were Christians, some were not Christians. We interviewed people of other traditions and faiths as well. And there were a couple, we also interviewed our seminary professors, because there had been a pretty big gap, and we wanted to know why they stay Christian. You're brilliant, thoughtful, mindful people, and some of this stuff just doesn't fit, right, or doesn't make sense to us. So help us, tell us about you and why you chose to stay. So that was all really powerful. And we stopped in Omaha, Nebraska, of all places, and we learned about this amazing thing called the Tri-Faith Initiative, where it was the 3 Abrahamic faiths, so Muslim, Jews, and Christians. They had this community together where they all had separate buildings for worship, but they had a community center where they engaged in community activities and stuff together. And I thought that was the most beautiful thing I have maybe ever seen. So that gave me a lot of hope, and just like, yeah, people are doing things like this in the world. And another just note is Mike and I were part of a social justice group at this time, and part of that group, Wes Granberg-Michelson, was the leader of that, and he was friends with Brian McLaren, and so we got to hang out with Brian McLaren. This was like 10 plus years ago, and interacted with some of the reading material and with him in person, and I just want to say that it's been a joy to kind of re-engage with him in this way through this book, because that was really meaningful as well. And then, for reasons I won't get into now, we had Ruben, our oldest, and then shortly after that we moved to Holland for 6 years. And we stopped going to church. And there were lots of reasons for that. When we would talk to other people, we would tell them it was because we had small children. And those of you who have had small children know what it's like.
Kudos to all of you with small children who are here. You're rock stars.
It's rock stars. We're just like, it's hard with nap time and, all that stuff. But really, we just needed a break. Like, we had been doing a lot of thinking and journeying. And so, yeah, it was sort of, felt like kind of a plateau. And we would certainly have conversations along the way, but not many. Fast forward, we moved back here to Ada 3.5 years ago. And obviously, my very good friend Mara was the pastor here at the time. And so Mike and I were talking, we're just like, should we go back to church? There's already this community of people that we know, a lot of the people, and love them. And yet, we don't know if that makes sense for us anymore. So we did come back, and it was an interesting experience. Parts of it were really lovely, and parts of it caused a lot of dissonance for me. It was pretty jarring, I think, after being away for 6 years, to come back and have some of the language come back around that I didn't really use anymore. I didn't really pray in the same way. Engaging with scripture was not really something that I did. And so it caused a lot of internal dissonance for me, and I was doing a lot of mental gymnastics, like translating things like, okay, they're saying this, so I could interpret that like that for me. And that was sort of exhausting. And so then COVID hit, and it was sort of like the same thing that happened when we had babies. It was like, oh, there's a break. So we just stayed home. And I was able to sort of disengage and feel like I don't have to struggle. I don't have to battle with this internal thing anymore. So then, fast forward to now, Mara was talking to our group about doing this series, and I just got giddy. I was like, are you serious? Like, you're actually going to do this in front of church?
She asked me out for breakfast one day, which was unusual. And I was like, okay, sure. And she's like, I have something I want to talk to you about. And I get that a lot. People are just like, hey, I need to talk to you about something. And like, okay. So at breakfast, she was like, so this series. And she was like buzzing, like, I want to do it. I want to be in it with you.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a lot of conversations about what that could look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And just told her I would like to be a part of it in any way that you will let me. Because I think this is a really important conversation, and I think a lot of people are having it, whether they're having it internally or among, their close circle of friends or whatever. But what would happen, if we brought this conversation to a broader audience?
Mm-hmm. Is that why you wanted to be part of it? Does that capture it, or is there more?
I think because of the people that I engage with and work with, I knew I wasn't alone. Like, I knew that I wasn't the only one who was having these thoughts and questions and wonderings and doubts, all of those things. And so I thought, what if we talked about it more openly? And I thought maybe if I could be brave enough to do it, that would give people permission to show up. Because, you talk about, what is it, authentic relationships, difficult conversations, like
erring on the side of
grace.
Let's
Do that, right?
So what's been meaningful to you about the series?
I would say I've been surprised by the openness of the people that I've been engaging with, primarily through the book group, because that's where more of the intentional dialogue is happening. But just a lot of people just showing up very vulnerably and very honestly, and made space for me to do the same. And I have felt very held and not judged in that process. How about for you?
Yeah, it's. I think for me, it's been meaningful to bring a lot of. I mean, I have a lot of the same questions as you and as others that I've heard too, and it's been such a privilege to be able to create that space where other people can be open. As a pastor, there's different things at stake for me when people show up with me in this conversation, because I'm a pastor. Like, I very much have the Christian title, and my concern is always, has been even starting in the series, is can I create a safe enough space or a brave enough space for people to show up, even though I am obviously decidedly Christian, because pastor carries such a heavy thing. And so it's been really meaningful for me to have you be part of it as well, to kind of, I don't know, yin and yang. I don't know if that's the right way to say it.
Yeah.
Has there been anything that's been difficult?
So Mara and I had an interesting experience last week. So the first 2 weeks of the series, if those of you weren't here for that, there was more of the focus on like how the church has caused pain, right? And that really resonated with me. I was like, finally, like we're taking ownership over some of the stuff that the church has done. And I felt connected and was resonating and that kind of thing. And then last week, it was a really interesting experience during the service, because I could feel the difference in your system, in your body. There was this like relief last week.
I can just talk about easy things. It's going to be great. I can speak about my passions.
Right, and all that hope and that kind of thing. And I think you said something toward the beginning around like, yeah, this is a little bit easier for me, or something like that. And my system read that as like, oh, she's saying this is easier for her, and assuming that it's going to be easier for the rest of us. But for me, last week was actually harder to sit with, and some of the things were more activating and more triggering in some ways. And so we had to have some conversations around that. So I'll let you say more about that.
Yeah, so in the small group last week, on Zoom in the evening, we were just doing a little bit of processing about how the series had gone and what today was like. And I kind of had this like a little bit of a vulnerability hangover. Do you know what I mean by that? Like you like bleh, like put things out there and then yeah, I know some of you do. So I was in that space, and then when a couple of people shared that it was that day and hearing what I had said was difficult for them, I was shocked and a little bit just taken aback. And I was doing all the work to like, don't be defensive, try to be curious, try to be open. You have things to learn about this. And so we talked about it a little bit in the group, and I think from what I've heard from most people, that was probably the most fruitful conversation among group members, because we were finally like bumping up against each other. And that's always my fear. As a preacher, you all don't usually tell me what it's like for you when I'm
Not that she's inviting that.
No,
Don't get any ideas.
no. Actually, I am. So what I learned is that the assumption that I had made, that because it's easier for me, it's easier for everyone else. And I just realized as a leader how frequently I probably do that. And it felt like once I was able to once we had some difficult conversations and were able to kind of work through what that was all like, I was really grateful, because this is the kind of thing that we have to dig into if we're going to figure out how do we do life together when we don't share, when we realize we don't share the same belief systems, or when the same things we don't share the same language. How do we live life together? And it's gonna mean that we're gonna say things that make each other uncomfortable. And we have to learn how to be open with each other about that, because that's where the growth is. The growth isn't in trying to be walk on eggshells so that I don't make Krista uncomfortable. That's not where the growth is. The growth is when I make Krista uncomfortable, then Krista says something to me about it, and we can have a conversation, and that's where the growth is. And I'm convinced that has to be something we grow in as a congregation, is bumping up against each other and then talking about what it's like. There's no roadmap for this. This is all an experiment, and that's where the work is done. So it was super hard, and I'm super grateful, and it was our long-standing friendship and commitment to one another that allowed us to talk about it in front of all of you. Isn't that nice? How often do you do that? Talk about some of your most intimate fights with close people in front of a whole crowd? But that's we both agreed that it was super important that we talk about the difficulty and talk about the way through it.
Yeah, and that makes me think of like the rupture and repair process, right? Like we're gonna have ruptures. We have that in almost any relationship. I work on that a lot with couples or with parents and their kids in my work as a therapist. And it was just such a beautiful experience for me to have you be able to receive it and to hold it, and for us to be able to work through it and to trust enough in our relationship to know that, like, yeah, that was uncomfortable, but it's not going to break us. Like, and it has in fact made us closer and stronger. So I'm grateful for that.
So how does all this show up in your work? You've alluded to it a couple of times. How does this wrestling with Christianity and the harm that the church has done, how does this show up in your work with your clients?
Yeah, so referring back to what you were saying about how identifying as a Christian is sort of important for you as a pastor.
It's sort of important. Just a little bit.
A little bit, I don't know. For me, it's sort of the opposite. And I haven't verbally called myself or referred to myself as a Christian in years. And there are lots of reasons for that. But part of it is because of the people that I work with, I'm not sure many of them would have come to me if they thought I was a Christian, because for them, Christians are not safe. Christians have caused harm and damage and have shamed them. So there's a lot of baggage around the word Christian that I think we've had a lot of conversations about, and in our book group we've talked a lot about as well, how a word is not just a word carries a lot with it. And so this shows up in a handful of ways in my work. So one thing I guess I want to note is sort of an echo of my social work program experience, is that I get the opportunity to interact with people very different from me, and they get to teach me about what's important to them, about their traditions, about their religions and values and all of those things, and I receive that with openness, and that is one of the gifts of my job that I love so much. And a few of the subpopulations that I see, so Mara has mentioned that I work with trauma, which is true, but one of my other areas of specialty, I'm a certified sex therapist, so I do a lot around sexual health and a lot of psychoeducation and that stuff around that as well. So people who come to me, one subgroup is the LGBTQ plus population, and I don't need to go into a ton of detail about how much hurt and pain and shame and ostracization the church has caused that particular group. So that's one group that I see this impact. I also see a lot of people come to me, and this is sort of twofold, this process of what people mostly call deconstruction, I would say, around the messages of the church that they grew up with. And some of that is about sexuality and sex and how they were either shamed or there was silence around that. They just don't have sex until you get married. That's it, right? We don't talk about pleasure or consent or healthy sexuality or that development, right? And so a lot of people come to me and they have to unlearn what they learned or didn't learn along the way and come up with, like, what does it mean to be a healthy sexual human being? So that's a big chunk of the work. And then alongside of that is just general deconstruction of messages that the church has given that has caused a lot of pain. And so they come with all of these questions and all of these things that don't make sense for them. And we work through that together. And then one more group where I see this show up is the complex trauma clients who grew up with long-term chronic emotional developmental types of abuse and neglect. And I have had clients say to me, I don't know how I could believe in God. I pleaded, I begged for God to intervene and to help me. And not only was there no supernatural kind of intervention, but God didn't even send a person to take me out of that environment. And I don't know how to make sense of that, right? I had to stay in that space for my entire childhood. And so there is just a ton of pain around that and lack of understanding. So I think with that, what I try to do is make space for grief and for questions and for doubting and wondering. And we work a lot around reframing with education, but also with, I use this image of a compass, right? So like when we're born, many of us are given a guide, a compass to say, like, this is what you should think, this is what you should believe, this is how you should behave, right? Whether it's from our parents or our community. And when many of these people come to me, their compass is either already shattered or they are in the process of dismantling it. And so our work together is to make, again, space for that grief, but also then they can sometimes feel like they're floundering, right? Like, at least I had a rule book back here. I don't really know what to do with all this now. I know that I'm kind of taking it apart, but I don't know where to go from here. And so I will help them reframe and kind of take a values perspective. I don't want to get into that quite yet because I want to talk about a couple of the reframing things that we have talked about. So one that shows up is something, just as an example, like total depravity, right? That's one that I really, really struggle with. Like,
Can you explain
this
what
message
total
that,
depravity
like,
is, in case there's anyone here who's been free of that?
Yeah, right. Original sin, like you are born terrible. Like we just come out of the womb, terrible humans. And for a lot of people, like they're just crying in my office about this shame that they carry that is so deeply rooted Like, I am not worthy, right? I am not worthy, and I am terrible, and just these like super core, deep wounds. And when I brought that up to Mara, she had an interesting response.
Yeah, so Krista comes at this from a therapeutic side. I come at this as a theology nerd, and so I was like, oh yeah, totally. Like, there's this doctrine of total depravity, but Richard Rohr talks about like what came before the fall in the book of Genesis. It's that human beings were created good and beautiful, and the word good is used a ridiculous number of times in the book of Genesis at creation, and that is the story that we are born into and that we need to live into as human beings. And then there's the total depravity comes next, and Richard Rohr says we've gotten that all mixed up. Like, you got to know that your created goodness, your beauty as a human being, in order to be able to figure out, like, what is it that you need to grow out of, and what is it that you need to reframe and change in your life in order to keep connected to that created goodness.
Yeah, so I think those are the kinds of conversations where, I mean, we're just two people, but the frame that we're coming from is like really helpful to talk about those things and for us to think about things from a different angle. And there's one other thing, and this is kind of in the context of my work, and again, Mike and I have been having a lot of conversations about this stuff over the past several weeks, and I considered claiming this quote as my own, but I will give you credit. Tell me if I get it wrong. But Mike said this the other day, and it blew me off my chair. He said something to the effect of, theology, and I'll add maybe some of our theology, is a conduit for intergenerational trauma. Theology is a conduit for intergenerational trauma, meaning that there are some parts of our theology or our belief system that perpetuates cycles of trauma and violence and pain and shame, and we need to stop it.
Intergenerational trauma is the way that, and this happens in Black communities impacted by generations of racism. It happens in all communities, is that we pass down our crap. Like, our pain, we figure out how to codify our pain and make it make sense, and then we pass it down to our kids until somebody stops it. And I hope that this work can be us figuring out how to stop that.
Me too. Amen.
Did we just have a little moment? I think we did.
That was a moment. Mike, did I get it right? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
That makes me so sad. And I have been part of that as a pastor in my earlier understandings of theology and Christianity, and it just makes me so sad of what I might have passed down to people. And I'm not going to do that anymore.
Same. Yeah. At least we're going to try.
We're going to try.
We're going to try not to. You can help us, hopefully.
Yes, please. Be gentle, though.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
I probably should say something
yeah.
now. Okay. So as you do this values work with clients, like reframing things in terms of values, can you tell us a little bit about what are some of your values as you've done your own reframing work?
Yeah, for sure. So I think part of it is that, and we'll hopefully continue to talk about this on this journey together, but the semantics can get tricky. I get stuck in words a lot. But having conversations about that is something that I value. So I'm just going to say some of the words that came to mind when I was thinking about values and my own values and my own compass. So mutual respect for and with other humans is a really big one for me, and I want to just note a caveat to that includes, for me, exploring what Brian McLaren talks in the book about, treasures of other religions and traditions and other humans, learning about those treasures and not being threatened by that. So that's one thing. Honest communication, love, dignity, and worth of all human beings, equity, inclusion, openness, wondering, curiosity, connection, courage, seeking understanding, and finding shared meaning. And I think the big one around that is how can we connect, how can we find shared meaning, and also value each other for how we are different and where we are different, right? We don't all need to be the same, and we're not all the same, and that's amazing. So how can we find some of that shared value while being different at the same time? And then two things that I would not say are values, but I have to say out loud because they've been life-changing for me over the last 7 years. And we've alluded to the polyvagal theory thing, and that is learning more about the body and the nervous system and why our body does what it does. That has been really, really helpful for me, reframing how I think about myself and how I think about other humans. And another thing is internal family systems, which is a model that I use in my work. That's kind of a parts perspective. I alluded to my rule follower part earlier. I have a perfectionist part. I have a Hulk part that kind of rages sometimes. And
Is that part green?
Parts. I mean, I don't know. I haven't decided on
Red
it
for
yet.
rage.
Red for rage. So we're all made of many parts. We're not this mono-mind kind of creature. And the nuance of that.
Which is also, I will say from my perspective, deeply biblical. Remember how Paul says, the good thing that I want to do, I cannot do. Like there's this wrestling that even Paul, who I have issues with, but even Paul talks about like this inner wrestling, like part of me wants this and part of me wants to do this. It's reflected in Scripture. I'll just, say that.
For sure. You know what my idea was recently? What if we looked at the Bible through a parts lens?
Huh.
Or a polyvagal lens? I think that would be really interesting.
That would be really interesting. Okay, there's an idea to put in the file.
Anyway, tuck that away. But anyway, when I was talking about the value stuff, something popped up.
Yeah, so when Chris and I, we've had a lot of conversations the past month, but in the past week, we were sitting in my office talking about this, and she was talking about being rooted in values, and I was like, ooh, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Because how I've come to understand this, and it's been clarified for me in the last couple of weeks, is being deeply rooted in the person and work of Christ is kind of where I have. Deeply rooted and radically open is the imagery that I've been using for my own kind of how I show up with this stuff.
And when she said that, I said, what do you mean by that?
What do you mean by deeply rooted in the person of Christ?
By deeply rooted.
So then I was like, well, it's things like do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. And then you were like, oh, those sound a lot like values. So even in bumping up against these things with one another, with digging in, we realized we're coming at the same things. We both want to be part of the healing of humanity, and she can do it in a way that I can't, and I can do it in a way that she can't. But I've been thinking about this imagery too when you talked about working with your clients and figuring out what is their value system. It's the image of a well. And this is from my days as a chaplain. What I learned is that it's not my job as a Christian chaplain to say, look, here's my well of spiritual meaning, and now you come with me to this well, and I'll show you what's in my well. That's not my role. My role is to go with them to their well and to explore with them what is your meaning system. And I think this is exactly the same thing. And when we can go to each other's wells, what we realize is that it's all connected to the same groundwater. That we're deeply rooted in something that's deeper than our language can describe. And that's where I want to dwell with people the way I want to live.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think being able to ask questions like that, like what if there's a word that brings up something for you or a song or whatever, like can you share that? Like what does that bring up, right? And when we can be connected or rooted in some of those values, even if I would say something completely differently than the way you would say it, right? There's still that like kind of core connection. And I guess it makes me wonder, like, what if we could do that, right? Like, what if we could share our different beliefs or our differences in a way that was connective in nature, and we could work together to value those things and stop letting fear, right? I feel like there's so much fear of the other that disconnects and destroys us. Like, what if we could do that?
What if we could do that? And it takes so much bravery. I mean, you see how much bravery Krista and I have had to find in the last week to be able to do this with one another, to say, when you said this, I felt this, and to be able to be with one another in that way, it takes so much bravery. And so let's make sure that we're erring on the side of grace, being authentic, having courage for tough conversations. I mean, that's all right there. It's all right there. So I am making a brave invitation that I want to hear from you about what are you hearing? What are you bumping up against in my preaching or in other things in worship, whether it's a song or words that are used in a prayer? That's how we move forward. Mm-hmm. But be gentle and brave, and I'll be gentle and brave too. Have you said everything you wanted to say? I mean, we could do this for like hours.
All day. Sorry.
But we need to stop. But is there anything else that you haven't said that you want to say? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm good.
Okay. And to close, what gives you hope?
Well, not to sound like a total cheeseball, but you,
Aw.
you give me hope. You all in this room give me hope that you're here, that you're willing to even listen and engage in this conversation alongside of us. My husband and my kids give me hope. My colleagues, my friends, my clients give me hope. People who are doing work toward equity and inclusion give me hope. And it's helpful to be reminded of those things as well.
So my instinct is always to close with prayer, because that's what I do. It occurred to me that I would like to invite you to choose how to close this time. So what do you want to do with us to close our time together?
So, I've been leading some of the experiences around the polyvagal stuff, centering stuff. So I thought it would be appropriate to bring that back around at the end. But even in this conversation, some things came up. So my idea was, just super quick, the vagus nerve is kind of what the theory is based around, and it's connected from the brain to all the major organs and limbs in your body. And it's also connected to the pharynx, larynx, and your inner ear. So when we hum or sing or sigh, that's a natural way that our body is trying to calm itself or regulate itself. So I thought, what if we did a song that would be familiar to all of us, but instead of singing the words, we hum it, or if you don't like humming, you can make a vowel sound or something like that. And the first song that came to my mind as something that was familiar was Amazing Grace. And I asked a couple people, and they were like, yeah, that feels right.
And then she asked me, and I was like, there's
Denied.
that little wretch word in there, saved a wretch like me. We can't do that. And I was like, no, we can't do that.
We don't want to be wretches. I don't know. That doesn't feel right. She goes, even if they're not singing the words, they're going to think it. And I was like, yeah, I know, but
right? Maybe we can transcend that.
Maybe.
So let's experiment.
I invite you to go on this experiment with us, and if it helps you to think of the words in your mind, you may do that. If it's a hindrance or not helpful, don't think of the words. So we're going to hum through Amazing Grace together. I'll start it in the microphone, and then I'm going to drop the microphone so that I can hear all of your voices as well. And I want you to just focus on how it feels. I want it to be connective for yourself in your own body, and feel how that humming sound impacts your system. And then also this sort of radical resonance with those around you, and hearing other people's voices doing a similar thing at the same time. Are you open to this experiment with me? Yes? Okay. Perfect. So let me just take a breath for a second.
I think that's a good place to stop. As we go from here, my friends, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May God make God's face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May God look upon you with kindness and give you peace. Amen.